Thank you so much. Such an interesting concept to democratize the defense and detect task. Very nice, thank you. We are now moving to the next session, and look, as the previous one was about C and C, the next one is also about C. The name of the session is C for the change, the evolving role of the CISO and how it impacts startups. And for this, we are going to have here a panel of representatives from these various roles, and I want to invite to the stage Meny, the co-founder and CEO of Opus Technology, Yoni Shohet, CEO and founder and CEO of Valence Security, Sounil, CISO and head of research of JupiterOne, Frank Kim, the CISO-in-Residence of YL Ventures, and I want to invite also Mandy, Andress, the CISO of Elastic. And for this panel, the one who is going to lead the panel is our Andy Ellis, the operating partner of YL Ventures. Happy to have you here, Andy. Please.
Thank you all. Welcome, folks. I appreciate you taking some time out of your day to talk about how the CISO role has evolved and how that evolution is affecting startups, not just the CISOs, because we know it affects everybody. So I want to start with a question for the CISOs on the panel, which is really, things are evolving so rapidly. We just saw, brand new attack styles. And as that evolutions are happening, what skills do you see that CISOs need to deal with the new and emerging threats? So imagine you're giving advice to somebody who's about to become a CISO or wants that CISO job. What are the skills that you're going to recommend that they're focusing on so that they can deal with the rapid pace of change? You go first.
All right, I'll go first. For me, it is being comfortable that things are always going to change, and that something that you worked really hard on and you implemented could be completely useless the next day. And it's just the ever-changing configurations, issues, systems. That last presentation just scared me, so I got to go figure that one out. But it's really focusing on learning, curiosity, making sure that you're really adaptable and open to change and not getting too focused on things that you've implemented.
For me, I started my career as a developer, as an engineer, writing a bunch of code that unknowingly had a lot of security vulnerabilities in it, and I had to go figure out how to fix them. And coming from a technical background, I always thought that I would always focus just on the various technical aspects. But as I moved up into different lead and leadership and management roles, security officer roles, I realized by making a bunch of bad mistakes, not being able to communicate with other people in the organization, that one of the key skills for any security leader is storytelling. And if we're thinking about, well, how do we tell that story of what we're doing, how it's aligned and supporting the business, one of the things that startups can really help us with is helping us as security leaders tell that story, translating all of that technical information into a picture that actually makes sense.
So maybe following on Frank's comment, let me clarify a misconception, which is that we as CISOs need to keep up with the technical elements of those threats. So yes, I would love to be able to communicate a highly technical threat to my stakeholders, but that is a high bar for us to keep up with the technical details associated with some emerging threat. So going back to the question around startups, I need a translation function that Frank just mentioned. I need to be able to tell that story, and so I need the startups to tell me something that I can then communicate back to my stakeholders so they understand the threats. Oh, actually, not just so they understand, so I understand the threats, okay? And as much as I would love to say I'm a technical person, over time, that atrophies, and I do need to tell a story. But I also don't have the time to understand the threats as well as perhaps the startups do.
Right. You might hear that presentation and translate it to your CEO, and they'll say, oh, we should just block Spotify and we'll be safe from all botnets, right? So no, I definitely get that. So this question is going to go for everybody, but I want the entrepreneurs to lead with answering this one, which is, what have you seen over the last few years about how engagement has changed between CISOs and startups? I think that the way it was 10 years ago is definitely not what it is right now, but how are you seeing that evolution playing out right now? And I think you two probably spend most of your time talking to CISOs. So what have you seen?
I guess it definitely has changed over the last, I think, 5 to 10 years. I think there's a lot more openness. I think to some of the innovations, some of the startup mentality, that I think this different or dynamic nature of threats or what the CISO role is kind of brought together. And I think I typically like to think about it 2 or 3 different areas. I think the one is that a lot of new areas coming in and stuff that people are not maybe expert on. And maybe it's different types of posture issues, or maybe it's the risk of AI or whatever other risks come in. And sometimes that specialized knowledge that startups, early stage startups that are expert in a specific field can bring is very unique. I think the second is that a lot of CISOs or a lot of organizations are a little bit snowflakes. They have their own issues, they own their whole thoughts, they have their own priorities, and a lot of the bigger vendors might put less of an effort in trying to solve your specific problem as an organization. And I think we could do a good job as a startup to do that. And the third, and maybe the most obvious, is cost effectiveness. I think we're in a pretty significant or more strained financial markets. And I think the ability to create value and solve solutions for organizations today in a cost-effective way is really important in this market.
So I think that if you look over the past 3-4 years with the COVID, work from home, and the different transitions that we've seen in the market, maybe to Sounil's point, the threat landscape is ever changing, and we need to constantly adapt to that. And I think a lot of CISOs are realizing that startups and entrepreneurs are a good way to be better educated about the new threat landscape, maybe not about today's most burning problem, but about something you need to be concerned of when you think about your roadmap and when you think about project management. And early collaboration is key in order to make sure that you're both well educated and also that you're able to be well prepared for the continuous changes, because there are a lot of changes happening, whether if it's with technology, cloud adoption, whatever it is, and also a lot of changes within organizations, macroeconomic and everything else, that requires constantly being with your hand on your pulse and making sure that you're well adjusting as the technology evolves.
How are you, CISOs, how are you seeing this? Does that reflect your experience? Are you seeing different ways that you're engaging with startups or that your peers are?
So I've actually created a way to engage with startups because the language that we use is important, and I wanted a consistent way to understand what problem people are trying to solve. So for example, if I asked you, how do I get to Bethlehem? You might say, head east, right? And I would say, no, I'm at Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And so we're talking a different, we have different perspectives on what problem we're trying to solve, just because we don't have a consistent, repeatable way to explain the problems that we have and the problems that, the solutions that they have. So for those who don't know, I created something called the Cyber Defense Matrix, which just helps.
And wrote a book about it. I'll say that so you don't have to.
Thank you. And so it's been a useful mechanism to communicate back to the buyers what problem you're trying to solve. I had a chance to actually go to a Taiwanese cybersecurity conference where every vendor had a copy of the Cyber Defense Matrix, and I could easily see what problem they're solving. How remarkable was that as a buyer?
That's amazing.
Yeah, that's very cool. You know, going to the question, I know that as a CISO, I can pick up the phone at any time and buy whatever product that I want. But Yoni really mentioned a key word, and he said collaboration. As a buyer, what I'm really looking for is not just the product, not just the tool, but I'm looking for partnership. Certainly, cost is important, threat defense is important, but there's many other factors on whether or not a solution, a tool, a capability that I try to deploy internally is going to be successful or not. The capabilities of my team, the capacity of the team, the capacity of the organization. There's a lot of people elements, and it's those type of things that in partnership, you know, I'm looking for a startup to help with.
Yeah, for me, what Meny started with really resonates. I've certainly seen that change, but also from a talent retention perspective, folks like to learn new things, play with the new technology, interact with really, really smart researchers. Most of what we have to do in the security space is rather boring at times, patching things, keeping things configured securely, but being able to really work on and work with startups and teams and use that as a way to keep their technical abilities with the new threats, but also continuing to keep them engaged and interested and not just getting bored with some of the basics.
Okay, so this one's for the CISOs, and this is going to be the uncomfortable question, which is our roles are changing, and probably what the SEC did last week, probably it's going to change it a lot. For those who aren't aware, they delivered a Wells notice that says they intend to seek some form of prosecution or something around the CISO of solar winds. And I think we have seen the evolution of the CISO role, but what are you seeing how that actually is translating to your day-to-day? Like we've talked about the boards needing more cybersecurity visibility, but I don't know that every CISO sees that. How are you seeing your role change over the last year and over the next year?
I'll go ahead and start. And this is one I actively am seeing changes. So first, the SEC in the US with the cyber disclosure rule that they proposed should go into effect in October if it continues. And then what Andy just mentioned, the recent Wells notice, it's much more governance. I was always doing reporting, senior leadership, board reporting, but it's even more. It's much more anxiety-driven, kind of on their side, because they're now being held more accountable.
And anxiety producing on your side?
Exactly. It flows, it continues. And so there's much more focus, which as a CISO, I love to have the focus, but how can we, to Sounil's point, tell the story to make that focus be something that is valuable and helpful, rather than just asking questions to ask questions because they feel that they need to.
You know, even though there's a C in the CISO title for chief, historically, and even still in current times, the CISO is not necessarily considered a C-level executive in the same way as many other organizations. And I think we all know that saying that traditionally, security is the team that always says no. So in my mind, there are three different types of CISOs. There's the dictator, the one that always says no, but then there's the collaborator, right? The collaborator is somebody that, hey, there's a problem that occurs, a business issue, risk that arises, and you and the team go and try to help solve that risk. Now, that is good, that is a lot better, but really what we want to do is we want to try to be a number three, a partner. Somebody that's not just asked to come to the table when there's an issue, but somebody that always has a seat at the table. And it's that spectrum of where you are as a security leader that informs downstream things like, oh, well, why isn't there even a discussion that you're going to have executive level insurance coverage? Why aren't you in these board conversations? Why don't you always have a seat at the table? And I think that's still the transition that a lot of organizations are making, not just security leaders, but organizations trying to understand how to best position the CISO for success.
So I'm actually pretty disturbed that Tim Brown at SolarWinds may face criminal charges because of this, or even civil charges for that matter. And I think one of the things that I think startups can help us do collectively is to reframe how we think about this word cybersecurity. I think most of what we actually do is practice cyber safety. Now, what's the difference between cyber safety and cybersecurity? Well, safety, if you put the word food in front of it, it's hygiene, it's compliance, it's inspections. If you consider that we've always said compliance doesn't equal security, it's because compliance is safety. Yes, so that's why it doesn't equal security. We are chief information safety officers, okay? Now, let's use a slightly different analogy. And if I'm Boeing or if I'm Airbus and I'm an aircraft engineer, my job is aircraft safety. It is not my job to dodge Russian missiles. If a Russian missile hits me, SolarWinds, should I be liable? No, I should not be liable for trying to dodge a Russian missile. Rather, that's the job of some other entity to make sure that the airspace is free of Russian and Chinese missiles. Whose job is it to make sure that the airspace, the cyberspace, is free of those missiles? And I would argue that's the public sector. So why should a CISO, a Chief Information Safety Officer, be liable for being hit by a Russian missile? And sure, I may have damaged a lot of people underneath me, but at the same time, that's not my job. And so again, startups, characterize what we do as safety, because that's the change I want, that's the C I want to change here.
I'm totally down with that, but I think we're going to have a hard time convincing a lot of people, but I still think that's a great way to look at it. You know, what the CISOs didn't mention, but I know is happening, is budget. Like, for a very long time, CISOs basically had access to budget. Nobody wanted to go in and slash the security budget in general. I'm not saying in specific, nobody faced that budget pressure, but we're hearing from a lot of CISOs that there's budget pressure. And they're either have their budget frozen, no spending that isn't already committed, or they're having budget cuts. So entrepreneurs, like, obviously that affects your lifeblood, is the revenue that you're looking for. How is the knowledge that this is happening affecting both how you design your products and how you're pitching your products to CISOs to make sure that you're sort of fitting within their headspace?
So I think the key is focusing on ROI, on something that the CISO on the other side can measure and then also communicate comfortably internally to justify an investment. In order to justify ROI, you need to also focus on a broad enough and an important enough landscape that justifies an investment and a return. For example, in our case, we really expanded our focus beyond just looking at specific SaaS security issues to provide a much more comprehensive and holistic SaaS security platform. And then from a CISO standpoint, they don't need to buy 5 products, maybe they just need to buy 1 product, and they get a good enough coverage for the risk that they're concerned of, and they can justify how with a small investment they ticked a lot of boxes that are important to them in terms of their security posture. And I think the second aspect in order to justify ROI is automation and making sure that whatever you can have a software or machines to automate for the security team and save on headcount and save on maybe just mind share that the security team doesn't need to go and do the same repetitive manual tasks again and again is very beneficial and opens up a lot of time for the security team to focus on other tasks, and again justifies the ROI, saying if we buy this product we can do other stuff and we can expand our security program to cover more risk surfaces that are critical for the business.
Yeah, so the word is ROI, for sure. I would say maybe a few years ago it was more about just almost like project people did. They might not actually lead to value, but sometimes the company engage them to research and learn more. Those are gone. So if you can't deliver the value and actually bring something that's actionable, valuable to customers, to CISOs, to whoever that is, I don't think you're going to be able to sell. And I think that speaks not just to the actual ROI of the actual sale itself, but also the ROI in the product itself. In terms of when we think about product, it's much more around what can deliver measurable, demonstrable ROI in terms of people can actually see that. It's not just about delivering it, can you prove it? And it is something that we're really high on as well. And I think the third one is, how quickly can you get it? So it's just about putting the product, not just about the promise of ROI, is how quickly or how much time do the customer need to spend for them to be proven out that ROI. And I think for us, as part of how we engage customers, how we think about go-to-market, that has become an increasingly critical subject.
If I may add real quickly, so think about an American football team. I have 11 players. I can't add a 12th player. That's illegal. I need threat information to understand what the offense is going to do and shift my defenses accordingly, which means also that I may no longer defend some part of my organization. That sounds very scary. And maybe we may be faulted for, hey, why didn't you watch out for that player who they did a trick play and all of a sudden they scored. You know what? I only have 11 players. I can't defend everything. At some level, the threats is really the basis upon which we can make that determination. So you started with threats. I'm wanting to make sure that that's still clear in terms of with a limited budget, with a flat budget, I still only have 11 players. I need to reassign them. And that could mean you guys as startups tell me, you know what, this area I just don't need to defend anymore, perhaps.
I wait to see the startup that finds a successful strategy. Oh yeah, just stop doing that over there. But I am curious, I think as CISOs, you talk to a lot of startups. What percentage of the startups do you see that are making these moves that Yoni and Meny just suggested, which I think are fantastic, and how many are still like either I'm a point solution and I'm happy to be a point solution, or I'm happy to have it take a year to integrate? What percentage have shifted to accommodate the mindset that you're now in?
Well, Andy, if you don't mind, I'm still stuck on the budget question a little bit, and I'll try to tie in what you just asked about. And to give an example, I think we all know that when you're at a large organization, a lot of times budget is use it or lose it. At the end of the year, the fiscal year, if you don't use all of your budget, you have a risk of not getting that same budget back the following fiscal year. So we know this, and so what we do is we plan ahead, and we know that we'll maybe make some purchases in Q4 that we were planning in Q1, and so on. One year, finance calls me up and says, Frank, I know you already made those purchases, but we've got an extra $1 million. Is there anything else that you could potentially spend this $1 million on? And I went back to the team, my team, and we said, is there anything? We already did these other pre-purchases, and you guys might think this is crazy, but we turned down the $1 million. Because we knew that if we accepted the $1 million, what we bought would become shelfware, that it would just sit on the shelf and do nothing. And it wasn't just about the cost, but it was also about our ability to execute. We knew we couldn't deploy the thing, and it was about, well, threat defense. There was some threat defense. There were some factors in there that would potentially help us, but then we also knew that, number 4, importantly, there was no stakeholder support. And this ties back to exactly what Meny and Yoni were saying about the business value. And because stakeholder support, I use that as a proxy for the business value. I'm not talking an IT owner or a security owner. If there's a business owner that supports that capability, well, then you know you've done something right to tell that story. So whether or not, right, startups are taking this approach or not, this is where we want your help, right, in terms of telling that story again.
Say I had similar experience as Frank on the budget, and what I did was I created a list, so every year I knew what I could buy, what we could do, and it was factored into our next year's roadmaps, so we could take the money and take advantage of it. But also the budget perspective, I often find even teams that have flat or lose budget in the budgeting process, the minute something changes in the threat environment and there's a real issue, it immediately increases. And so I think some of it is just from a financial perspective and planning, but when you get down to what's the risk, what's the need, what's the safety of the organization, generally I have found that the budget is there. But from Andy's original question on the startups, I definitely see more of the startups that I'm engaging with now, certainly those that are kind of in their pre-seed, seed, just starting to get their message together, really focusing on that story, on that business problem. What do we provide your organization? Not the technical, my tool does this and this is how it ties into all of your infrastructure, your architecture. It's really focused on what is that cyber safety problem that we're trying to solve and how does that help your organization? And also doing so in a way that's not in a point solution. I often find security leaders really have a hard time sometimes being creative. Like I buy this security solution to do this thing, and now I have this problem, so I'm gonna go buy a solution to do this thing, where maybe if they called up Yoni over there, he's like, no, we could actually do that. It's not 100%, it might be 80% coverage of what you need or capabilities, but it's sufficient and you already own it, and we'll start there. And so I see the need for a lot of those conversations. That's some of the things I've been talking to other CISOs about recently.
Okay, let's talk about the human factor. And now, I've been very clear in lots of forums, and I'll reiterate it here, and I know Sounil will be happy because it's about safety, which is the human is never the error. Like, human error is not what you blame, it's the system that's at fault. If you're blaming the human, it means you have a badly designed system. That said, we have a lot of badly designed systems. And so we often talk about, like, how do we better support our users so that we don't end up with problems? And so, really, can you talk, what are some strategies you have seen that vendors can use to improve their technology so that the technology, works for the humans, so that we don't always throw the human under the bus when the vendor technology doesn't work? Like, what have you seen as initiatives and ways to drive change in your organization? And then you two can prepare for the what have you seen that's, coming out as trying to support those organizations. How do we get to a point where we don't have this argument about blaming humans?
I wish we had that. Phishing tests, I will go off for many, many hours on why phishing tests aren't necessarily the best thing to do. And it's all about tricking the user or having the user feel like they've been duped or forced to click on something, because you can manipulate the tests all you want. And so for me, it's really helping them understand, of course, why it's important, what it means for them, both in their role in their company, but also in their personal life. But from a startup and a systems perspective, it's just make it easy. Take that extra time, that extra effort to figure out what really is the user experience, and how can you provide the best, most positive user experience? Often hear comparisons to Apple and just kind of the ease of use of working in the Apple ecosystem. That's what security solutions need to do. You don't need to think about it. You just know that it's happening behind the scenes, or trust that it's happening behind the scenes, and make it invisible so a person can do their job and just be doing it safely.
Great.
Over the years, of course, done a lot of awareness training and phishing engagements, as Mandy mentioned, and to the point where at one organization we did a pretty good job, and the general counsel, the chief legal officer, she correctly identified a phishing email. And she saw it and said, oh, this is a little bit alarming, and was rushing out to a meeting and sent it to her assistant to say, hey, please forward this to the security team because it looks like it could be malicious. Well, what happened? What do you think the assistant did? Clicked on the email and got infected, right? And so a lot of times, traditionally, security folks will say, oh, well, people, humans are the weakest link, right? Well, we want to reframe that, like Andy said, is, humans aren't the weakest link, they're the primary attack vector. So what was missing from that situation is that, hey, we needed to spread knowledge and awareness of, hey, how can they have an impact on improving security, build that security-aware culture throughout the organization. So the approaches, back to the question, that excite me are when companies include other people in the remediation. They include, hey, what do developers themselves need to do? What do the users themselves actually need to do to build that muscle memory throughout the organization itself?
So every attack surface, your devices, your applications, your networks, your data, your users, are also sensors. We don't take advantage of those sensors. Every sense you have in your body, your eyes, your nose, your ears, your skin, they are sensors, but they're also your attack surfaces. But we know how to use those senses to our advantage. We haven't figured that out in our digital world. And then secondly, the second thing I would offer is an amazing book on, two books on cybersecurity that I would encourage all you Israelis to read. One is by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, and the other one is Richard Thaler's Nudge. If you want to read about cybersecurity and how to deal with people, these two books, which are not entirely about cybersecurity, but entirely about how we think, are tremendously valuable books to read.
Great.
I think the key is, like Frank mentioned earlier, is partnership. You need to partner with your organization, with your business users, with the administrators, and obviously with the executive team to make sure we empower the business users to make the right decision. Eventually, in the vast majority of the cases, they don't want to make anything wrong. They don't want to get infected by malware. They want to do the right thing and make sure that eventually they do their job. And if we empower them to do their job in the best way without encountering hurdles that slow them down or make them find bypasses in order to eventually do what they need to do in order to eventually complete their KPIs, then that's key in order to make sure that the human factor is empowered to make the right security decisions.
Great. Meny, quick wrap us up.
Yeah, I would say, and it ties back a little bit to the changing role of a CISO, right? I think we are in a place in time now where security has never been a more or less, or more, I would say, cross-organizational effort. It's everyone. We talked about phishing and users, but it's a lot of developers out there. And the way we do security is fundamentally changing into a cross-organizational operations almost. It's part of what Opus does as well. But I think conceptually, we just need to look at security as a much more of an organizational, orchestrating risk, not necessarily just day-to-day tasks, and how do we enable people to have the right culture, trust, and overall make the right decisions on a day-to-day basis.
Awesome. I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your day, and everybody here for coming out to listen. So there's great nuggets here, and I hope folks take this away and help evolve their CISO role and their startups to help us secure a future or make a future more safe.